Okay, well, hello, good morning, and welcome to Hudson Institute. For those of you joining us for the first time, we're a 501c3 nonpartisan think tank organization based in Washington, D.C., promoting U.S. leadership and global engagement for a secure, free, and prosperous future. My name's Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow here, and I run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, looking at how authoritarian corruption is reshaping sort of global geopolitics. Of course, Venezuela is a highly relevant country in that regard, unfortunately. And today we're going to be talking about the future of US policy towards Venezuela. Been a number of important developments in the past few months. The removal of Juan Guaido as the interim president, the announcement that the opposition is going to work towards primaries to select a presidential candidate to run against Nicolás Maduro in the elections that are scheduled at least for next year. So we'll be mulling over all of that, looking back at what was done in the past and what has been done more recently by the Biden administration, what went wrong, what some things that maybe went better, and what really should happen next. And joining me today to discuss these, I'm delighted to welcome Jose Cardenas. He served under George W. Bush as the acting assistant administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. He was also on the National Security Council and at the State Department. Welcome, Jose. Carrie Filippetti, she's now the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition, but she served under the Trump administration as a deputy assistant secretary for Cuba and Venezuela, and as the deputy special representative for Venezuela at the State Department. And last but not least is our Hudson Senior Fellow Marshall Billingsley, who among many sort of senior former government roles, the most relevant today probably was as former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Treasury Department, where he helped oversee the implementation of sanctions against Maduro's regime. So welcome to you all. I'm going to sort of kick it straight over to you, Jose. Maybe you could sort of give us an overview of where we're at. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Nate, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for convening a very, very timely meeting. It's been 1 year since the Biden administration fundamentally reversed U.S. policy towards Venezuela by meeting directly with Nicolás Maduro in Caracas. And I think that in the interim year, we see an unfortunate example of what happens when the U.S. cedes the leadership mantle. I think that this administration has deprioritized Venezuela as an issue. And the result is that when the U.S. stands down, the jungle grows back. And I think that, unfortunately, Nicolás Maduro finds himself in a very, to him, a much more advantageous position. I think that for Maduro's worldview, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put a premium, of course, as we all know, on international oil exports. And Maduro believes he can leverage that to more advantageous international alliances and trade relationships. The second factor for Maduro that he sees today is more accommodating governments being elected in the region, in Colombia, in Brazil. So whereas during the previous administration, you had a lineup of governments shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. on pressuring Maduro regime, that is all gone today. Maduro has also gotten a bit of a bump from the de facto dollarization of the Venezuelan economy, and that has placated to a degree the private sector. And so there are some shortcomings to that, as we can get into in our discussion. I don't think that Maduro is as secure as he thinks he is. And then the final factor that we've seen over the last year and actually previous years is the outflow. 7 million Venezuelans have left the country. Those 7 million Venezuelans, I would hazard to guess, are not pro-regime. They are not pro-Maduro. So that discontent leaving Venezuela has redounded to the regime's benefit. as I said, I don't believe that Maduro is he should be as confident as he is. I think he's still vulnerable. The economy is extremely vulnerable. He's touting, for example, and I'll end on this point, he is touting, we had 10% growth last year, in the best in Latin America. Well, when you go back to, when you look at the last decade of Maduro's rule, you will find that they would need 20 years of 10% growth to get back where the economy was in 2013. So that data point is extremely important. Maduro is still vulnerable, but unfortunately, I think we're in a position that's created so much uncertainty because the United States, the signals that the Biden administration is sending is one of deprioritization of Venezuela. And as I said, when that happens, the world takes those signals and they're out to make the best deals possible that they can for their own interests if the U.S. is not leading.
Thanks. Carrie?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you all for joining in person. I think the other way to think about the title of this session is, has the United States given up on Venezuela? I kind of rephrase that a little bit to say, has the United States forgotten about Venezuela? Because in some respects it feels less of an active choice and more of just a policy passing the administration by. I think there's three main things that this administration has forgotten about when it comes to Venezuela. The first thing is we've forgotten that the policy goal that we have is democracy for Venezuelans. It is not ease of access for American oil companies. And this is to Jose's point that the current crisis in Ukraine is causing a sort of reprioritization in this administration that is actually doing what Democratic governments often have accused Republican governments of doing, which is over-prioritizing big business and big oil. We've seen this in the fact that the Chevron license that was provided shortly after the initial trip to Caracas that Jose mentioned provided absolutely no substantive benefit to a single Venezuelan. The only people that it benefited were, of course, Chevron itself and then the Maduro regime. So it's clear that the choices that they're making are focused not on the Venezuelan people. We're also seeing that in that there are ongoing negotiations in Mexico. And in theory, these negotiations are to push for a free election in 2024. And yet at the same time, we're seeing the Maduro regime pushing forward new regulations, particularly as they relate to NGOs, that are essentially making such NGOs illegal. And having a free civil society is absolutely essential to any democracy, and yet there has been no effort to fight against this new NGO law that is currently being proposed. The second way in which we've forgotten about Venezuela is, to Jose's point, we've forgotten that U.S. leadership in this context matters. In the Trump administration, something we were very proud of being able to achieve was a 60-plus member coalition of countries that recognized Juan Guaido as the constitutional leader of Venezuela. That was an enormous diplomatic effort by Foreign Service and appointee officers alike. It was a remarkable achievement. And then it was followed up by engagement in the OAS, engagement with the Lima Group, engagement with the Rio Treaty for the first time since September 11th, 2001. And so there was this recognition that international community has an integral role in creating that external pressure against the Maduro regime. We know that Maduro cares about his international standing. We know that that kind of pressure is important. And yet, because the U.S. has not decided to strongly back Venezuela, we're starting to see that fall by the wayside as well. I also would suggest that American retreat from leadership here is partially responsible for the end of the interim government. I think the United States' support for the interim government was a huge reason why the opposition was able to stay together and use that framework. And when it was clear that we didn't have a position, then naturally, you started to see some more infighting among members of the opposition. So I do think we have a role to play in the disintegration of the interim government. We can talk about this later. I think there's pros and cons to that dissolution. It's not entirely negative. but we can get into that if it's of interest. And then the third way that I think the United States has forgotten about Venezuela, we've fundamentally forgotten about the nature of the regime. You know, we've had, I don't know, 5 negotiations over 8 years, none of which were successful, all of which ended because of the Maduro regime. We are continuing to see the human rights violations. The fact-finding mission just pushed out its most recent report saying that the situation is deteriorating and getting worse and worse every day. And we've forgotten that when it comes to America's role, it's not just providing diplomatic support, it's also providing that monetary and financial support. When you have a regime that we're just seeing, there were individuals who stole $3 billion, the interim government and the opposition is going to have to compete with an extensive amount of money, and it's not clear to me that the current administration is providing that sort of operational support. We'll also criticize my own administration for not providing enough operational support at the time too, so that's something that's been consistent over the last 2 administrations, but it's something that they'll need. So I do think the United States has forgotten about Venezuela. I don't think everybody in the United States government has forgotten about Venezuela. We have some excellent people who are still working there. But unfortunately, it does seem that we have, you know, to Jose's point, deprioritized it and forgotten the key elements of our leadership, what the purpose of our policy is, and the nature of the Maduro regime.
Marshall, who I should have said joins us fresh off a flight from a whirlwind tour of the Baltics. So
No, it's great to be here.
glad you could make it, Marshall.
No, and I'm glad, Nate, that you're hosting this event. You know, like my friends, I do believe the administration has turned its back on Venezuela. It's deeply frustrating, given how much energy and effort was put by the previous administration into building the necessary leverage over Maduro and his regime to drive ultimately a diplomatic solution, but one that resulted in free and fair elections and ultimately his removal from office. And that was our plan. I genuinely have no idea what the administration's strategy for Venezuela is, nor in fact do I see any coherent strategy towards the entire hemisphere. You know, we've gone from and fair that many White Houses deprioritize Latin America. It's much to my frustration because this is our hemisphere, we live here. Trump administration was an outlier in the sense that the president himself repeatedly was involved in decisions, you know, across the hemisphere, but particularly with an eye on Venezuela itself, and I can find no evidence of any of that now. Maduro doesn't live in a vacuum, and so he very much sees how the United States negotiates in other contexts, such as with the Iranians. And I think what he perceives is that much as the Iranians have found it to their advantage to continue to string this administration along on the nuclear talks, because of course, just as is the case with Venezuela, the administration's not imposing the sanctions that we levied, in this case on the Iranian oil sector. Here, in the case of Venezuela, likewise, no new sanctions have been imposed by this administration at all, 0, and the enforcement of the existing sanctions is non-existent. Things are happening today which would have been aggressively impeded under the previous administration. For instance, Iranians shipping multiple cargoes of condensate and other gasoline and other commodities to help the Venezuelan oil industry continue to produce. In a prior day and age, just 2 years ago, those shipments would have been targeted and impounded by the Justice Department, as we did repeatedly. Likewise, Venezuelan shipments of crude, the Chevron deal is just a deeply disturbing prioritization of crony capital over principle, and we weren't blameless on that in the Trump administration either, to be honest. But this current deal with Chevron is, in my view, outrageous. The fact that the day after the license is issued, who do they meet with but Tariq el-Assami to begin negotiating, right? The drug kingpin who's running the drug trade for the Venezuelan regime into the United States, who's also happens to be in charge, or was in charge until recently, for the PDVSA oil production. During much of the collapse in revenues and the collapse in GDP is purely to Chavismo's fault and purely to Maduro's incompetence. And you could see these trends starting in 14, 15, greatly accelerating in 16. But during the Trump administration, with our sanctions and our pressure, we saw GDP contract by about 16% in 2017, and then consistently growing 28% or so in 2019, 30% reduction in GDP in 2020. Then magically, what happens in 2021? A complete reversal. The economy starts growing, about 1% growth under Biden's first year in office. His second year in office, I don't believe the 10%, but I do think growth by around 6% of GDP in 2022. And now they're saying this year, the latest numbers are that it'll grow by about 6.5%, which would make it the fastest growing Latin American economy. Now, fair enough, they're coming from a pretty low barrier there, but the fact that we have removed pressure, economic pressure on the regime. This GDP growth, by the way, is not domestic consumption driven. This is not because now there's more manufacturing and more goods that are available to the Venezuelan people. This is the net exports of raw materials that the regime controls, from which the regime siphons enormous amounts of money to pocket itself, and for which it then employs to do such things as put its finger on the scale in Brazil with Lula's election by funneling money there. We saw them in the Trump administration moving money to AMLO in Mexico. We've seen them prop up the Argentinians. So you see this as Venezuela begins to rebound, not only does their recalcitrance for allowing democratic reform in Venezuela grow, because there's no reason why they should agree to anything at this stage. They're benefiting, and they're paying no cost for the benefit, but their ability now to funnel funds to other socialist kleptocratic regimes around the region grows. And so that poses, I think, a compounding problem for the United States. Again, I don't have a ready solution for what the next step should be. Sanctions in and of themselves are no substitute for a policy, but we have no policy. Thanks, Nate.
Thank you. So that's a unanimous thumbs down, I think, so far for the Biden administration on Venezuela policy. I wanted to start on the sort of international stage before we go into the sort of the very murky weeds of all the sort of opposition politics and all the rest of it. I think was it last couple of weeks ago, we saw Xi Jinping embrace Vladimir Putin as he departed Moscow and say, changes are underway that haven't been seen in 100 years, and you and I are leading this. What role, as you said, Maduro doesn't exist in a vacuum. He keeps a keen eye on international developments like that. What role do you think he thinks he can play as the autocratic leader of Venezuela, in this emerging, I've seen it called an axis of the aggrieved, so sort of Russia, and led by China, but with Russia and North Korea and Pakistan, Iran, all these people who are opposed to US, leadership in the world. What role do you think he sees for Venezuela? And I'll throw that open to any of you.
Well, I believe that he first and foremost believes in his own mind that is a confirmation of his own legitimacy to be seen, being photographed with these other leaders, authoritarians mostly, because hardly any small d Democrat would want to be photographed with Maduro at this point.
An exception being John Kerry at the recent climate things. Right. But we had a good handshake and chat.
And Gustavo Petro in Colombia. But you notice everybody goes to Caracas. They don't invite Maduro to their capitals. Mm-hmm. And the last time in Argentina he was supposed to go to Buenos Aires, is the opposition said, if you come here, we want you to be arrested. So, but be that as it may, Nate, I think that his first and foremost objective is this veneer of legitimacy that he gets when he meets with these other leaders, and he needs access to banking systems because the U.S. has pretty much shut him out, mm-hmm. and so these sorts of authoritarian regimes can provide him some access for the types of nefarious activities that the regime is engaged in, illegal gold smuggling, the illegal trade of oil. So it's legitimacy and access to banking that he really sees. But he is not what he wants most of all is to be accepted in polite company in Latin America. And right now, that's a very iffy play for him because he cannot travel there around the region without blowback.
I would just say I agree 100% with what Jose said in terms of how Venezuela and how Maduro sees itself in light of this company. But I also might answer the question of how do those countries see and want to use Venezuela? Because I think there's this narrative that's out there that because China is the most obvious adversary to the United States, we need to basically pivot all of our resources towards the Indo-Pacific. And this is a perfect example of why that strategy is very short-sighted. What China wants is not regional hegemony. What China wants is global hegemony. They've been very clear in their own writings, and this is something that Matt Pottinger writes about all the time, really assessing what they're saying in their own language. And they see Venezuela and other illicit and illegal regimes like the Maduro regime as a key component in their strategy. This is why they engage in the sanctions busting for Venezuela. This is why China provides an enormous amount of surveillance technology for Venezuela to keep control over its population. This is why both have provided to some extent loans and other gifts to the regime to keep it in power, to prevent it from falling victim to the power of American sanctions. So it's just a reminder that if the reason the United States is pivoting away from Venezuela is because of this idea that we need to be focusing our resources only on the Indo-Pacific, it is very short-sighted because the Indo-Pacific is not only focusing its resources there, they're focusing it also on Latin America, Africa, and increasingly because of America's departure from Afghanistan in the Middle East as well.
One, I think, important distinction to make within the dictatorial regimes that Maduro courts and that he has given little choice but to associate with is the distinction between the relationship that they have, that he has, the regime has with the Russians and the Cubans and the Chinese, with the very troubling arrangements that are being made now with the Iranians and with Hezbollah. So in many, many respects, Venezuela is run by a thin veneer of extremely corrupt and extremely wealthy Venezuelans, but propped up by a control apparatus staffed and administered by others, by other nations. The Cubans maintain the Praetorian Guard that provide his personal security. The Russians provide a lot of the cyber and signals intelligence work to crush down on any form of opposition and any type of indication of problems inside the Venezuelan military. But it's the Iranians who have moved in, and we noticed this, we saw this begin to happen in, I'd say, 2018, but very, very much in 2019, as the Iranians became very interested in Venezuelan gold. As we began to crush down on the oil exports, Alex Saab and his like took a pivot towards the strip mining in the Orinoco Belt. And the gold production there is of value to the Iranians for a variety of reasons. One, it's a very useful way to get around U.S. sanctions on Iran itself, and it becomes a funding mechanism for Hezbollah. And so we've now seen both Iran and Hezbollah jump in with both feet into the gold trade. Now, some of what they're selling in exchange for the gold are these oil cargoes that I mentioned, the condensate cargoes, the feedstock. Weapons are also being trafficked too. And so that's a qualitatively different and much more dangerous situation and relationship perhaps than even with the Russians or the Cubans in there. We have some guardrails. We understand some of the rules of the road with the Russians and the Cubans on how you operate. With the Iranians, who still believe they have not paid us back for Soleimani's death, who have, as we've heard in recent days from Central Command, conducted 83 attacks against U.S. servicemen in the Iraq-Syria region, and Hezbollah, who's got the blood of hundreds of Americans on its hands. To see them now worming their way deeply into Venezuelan society, into economy, into the control mechanisms, creates a huge potential for miscalculation and a huge potential for ultimately forcing this administration or the next to have to take action because Iran miscalculates and does something in the region that's unacceptable to us.
Well, thank you. Well, so I suppose the big process that's ongoing this year is the opposition's, efforts to sort of organise itself and to run a successful primary process to select a presidential candidate who will hopefully go forward and face, Maduro in elections next year. I wonder if I invite you to sort of reflect on that. What role can the US play in supporting that process, or should it not support that process? Do we think that the elections are not a good idea, given they'll probably be, the Maduro regime will probably do everything it can to make them fraudulent?
Yes.
I wonder if, Jose, if you could, any sort of thoughts on that front?
Certainly, Nate. I think that the United States has a crucial role to play. Right now, the opposition obviously is split, they're split politically, but physically as well, because you have a lot of leaders of the opposition, recognized leaders of the opposition who have been forced to leave the country, but there are those who are still there confronting the regime. Now, I don't have a lot of patience for people who sit there and spill a lot of ink on divisions within the opposition. I mean, you take on an authoritarian regime, and you see, what a day in the park that is. So this is a regime that will think nothing of certainly, exile is the most benign. But I think that the U.S. has a fundamental role to play in guaranteeing the safety of a lot of these. Under the Trump administration until now, I think the Trump administration was very clear that to the regime that you don't touch a hair on Juan Guaido's head, because then we'll really mean business. And I think that the U.S. has a role to play in guaranteeing the safety of the opposition, physical safety. And I think that the United States also has a very visible role to play in all of the ways we can do it, and of helping with the process of the primary process of, there's many Venezuelans, millions of Venezuelans who have absolutely no faith, for example, in the electoral authority known as the CNE in Caracas, to in any way engage with the electoral authority to decide who is going to be the primary process. And I know Kerry can speak a little bit about this as well, is the operational process of how do we help the opposition decide who's going to be the candidate in what we all are assuming is going to be an election next year. There is no date for the election, and there are still a number of absolute tremendous hurdles for any semblance of a competitive election next year in Venezuela, to say the very least. But we should nevertheless be helping the opposition push forward, and deprived of resources, there will be so many people who will be ready to denounce the United States for interference in this and supporting the opposition with U.S. money and all that. Well, who else is going to be there to support them? The regime is going to deny every dollar it can to help the opposition. So I have no reluctance whatsoever, no reservations about the U.S. standing up to help them in a process to identify in a primary vote, as difficult as it is, as much as the regime will target it, but trying to come out of that with a recognizable leader of the opposition through a legitimate primary process.
I agree with all of that. I would say this is an important reminder of one of the most fundamental differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration when it comes to our policy in Venezuela, and that is that the Trump administration's view was essentially the objective here is not an election. The objective here is democracy. Elections are an important part of democracy, but they're not all of democracy. You need strong institutions and so on. And we took what might be seen as a maximalist approach, where we basically said, elections are like a free and fair election is basically like being pregnant. You are or you aren't, right? You're not a little bit free, a little bit fair. It either is or isn't. The Biden administration doesn't agree with that. The Biden administration believes if we can make sort of what they call incremental steps that make it more free and more fair, then over a period of time, democracy might return back to Venezuela. So that's just a fundamental difference between the two. I think it's important that whenever we talk about these 2024 elections, that we put them in quotes, because they're not real elections. We know they're not real because there was an EU electoral observation mission that went a few years ago. They made, I think it was 23 recommendations for how to make sure that elections in Venezuela are free and fair. Those recommendations, some of which take 12 months, 18 months, 24 months in order to actually get started in motion, and we've seen zero progress on any of them. So we can already say definitively that it will not be a free and fair election. That being said, I agree with the opposition's plan to engage in this process. Number one, because it's their country and they get to make the decisions about how they want to move forward. And number two, because I think it is important that what they're trying to do is demonstrate that the opposition is able to do things on the ground. They're able to mobilize, they're able to organize. And an election gives them the opportunity to demonstrate that, to go out and talk to the people. So I think that's important, even if we know that the outcome of the 2024 election is going to be fraudulent. How can the U.S. support? I agree with everything that, that Jose said, particularly the guarantee of safety. I think these assets that have been frozen since the Trump administration that we were never able to really get out need to get out after the primary candidate is chosen so that they can, you know, that's Venezuelan money, that's not American money. I'm not talking about funding a foreign political party. I'm talking about Venezuelan dollars after the opposition has elected their presidential candidate so that they can actually pose some kind of viable campaign just so that they can be out there in the country and be seen in the country. So we need to be doing that. The third thing we need to be doing is we need to be actually monitoring what's going on the ground so that we can hold the regime accountable when there are inevitable violations within the Mexico negotiation process. These are not two separate things. The Mexico negotiation process is theoretically supposed to be ensuring that those conditions for a free and fair election are in place. Obviously, it's not working, but the United States is now, rightly, I think, more of a party to these negotiations than we were in the Trump administration. And they need to be really using the leverage that we have to make sure that there are penalties when there are violations of this electoral process. And that's well prior to 2024. And the last thing that the Biden administration needs to be doing is coming up with Plan B. We know that the election is not going to be free and fair. The worst thing we can do is wait until 2024, see what turns out, see that Maduro won again, and then all of a sudden start scrambling for what do we do next. We need to know what sanctions are we imposing at that point, what informational efforts are we going to engage in, what are the financial and economic efforts we're going to engage in, what are the diplomatic and international efforts we're going to engage in. We need to have that in place so that the inevitable day this happens, we're actually able to do something about it. And we haven't just lost 2 years waiting for an election that we already knew what the outcome of it would be.
There was a great deal of concern, I think, within both political parties across this town when the Chinese stepped into the leadership vacuum created by this administration in the Middle East and brokered normalization of ties between the Saudis and the Iranians. And the Chinese motive for doing this, of course, is clear. China sees that as it continues to move down into a wartime footing, preparing to attack Taiwan, that it needs to make sure that it has guaranteed access to energy supply and that the United States will not be able to successfully impede that aspect of its economy in the event of hostilities. Watch China very carefully because it only makes sense that they would step in and start trying to meddle in the Venezuelan context in the near term as well. It's a similar leadership vacuum that's been created. The administration, if you notice, if you parse their words, they've started to waffle on the Mexico process. It's now the best option for a solution, but it's not, the administration's not closing the door to something else. So I would be very, very cautious and concerned about how things go in the coming months. For me, very simplistically, it would seem to me that if your main political benefactor of Venezuela, Vladimir Putin, is completely tied up and consumed by a war in Ukraine, has an economy under great stress and pressure there, and simply can't bankroll Maduro to the extent that they once did. The Cubans have no independent funding themselves. They sell bodies for oil. And the Iranians are racked by domestic political protests and by a growing resistance and freedom movement. It just would seem to me that now's the time to double down with pressure. Now's the time to really reinstitute the sanctions regime we had and bring the economy to the ground and bring Maduro to the table. This have your cake and eat it too approach, which is what's happening, he has zero incentive to agree to anything. He simply grows steadily stronger as time moves on. His war chest replenishes. His ability then to basically buy opposition members, because they've done it in the past, their ability to manipulate certainly any type of election held in Venezuela, and again, their ability to spread money around for political influence campaigns, not only around the region, but in this country as well, just grows over time. With this approach, time is on Maduro's side.
If I can pick up on Marshall's comments about sanctions, I think that, and Marshall knows this since he was the point of the spear during the previous administration, was that sanctions regimes are not static. If you are not constantly reviewing and plugging leaks, the target is going to be developing workarounds. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly what has happened, as Marshall has said, with Iran. And again, that has created the disincentive for Maduro to take seriously the policy goals of returning to some semblance of a negotiation with the opposition, with the ultimate goal, again, as professed by the administration, to reach some sort of a freer and fairer election in 2024. Maduro right now is under absolutely no pressure, and I think that the problem is that the administration, there's nothing wrong with saying we want to use sanctions to get to this diplomatic outcome. Okay, that's fair. But what's happened over the past 2 years is a decoupling of sanctions from the diplomatic objectives. And I think that we need to recouple sanctions with our professed goals in Venezuela. And that is seeing what activity is out there, as Marshall has said, and cut them off. In other words, incentivize Maduro more to tend to these goals or these diplomatic outcomes that I don't think anybody disagrees with. It's how do we get there?
Right. Well, thank you. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'm delighted to see a pretty healthy audience for a Friday morning here on a grey day in Washington, D.C. So I wondered if anyone in the audience had wanted to ask any questions or make a very, very brief comment. If so, could you put your hand up? I'll pick on you, maybe do 2 questions at a time. And if you could give your name and your affiliation or whatever organization you're working for, that would be helpful as well. Any takers? Just in the front row here, sir.
Thank you very much. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. I'm wondering how concerned are you about copycat regimes? In listening to, much of what was being said, one could almost, if you take out Venezuela, if you take out Maduro, you could probably just plug in a different country, and it could almost, we could almost be having a panel on that country. Specifically, I'm thinking about El Salvador. There isn't a situation, there are not the links to Iran, there's not the oil production, et cetera, keeping the differences in place. But it's an authoritarian path that the president is going. He's very close to China. He's he's closing civil space. He's going after opposition. So, and one could think, one could think of a title for a panel, has the U.S. forgotten about El Salvador, or is it looking the other way? So I wonder if anybody would care to comment on, similarities and U.S. policy, how to prevent, another Maduro down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. I should say, actually, on my to-do list is a panel just exactly about that, El Salvador. So I look forward to seeing you. But does anyone want to comment on,
Well, I think that if we revert to maybe a decade or 20 years ago, we were more enthusiastic about, and the United States had put, across successive administrations, Republican and Democratic, had put enormous amount of resources and political capital into the development, the consolidation, the spread of democracy in the region post-Cold War, and achieves just tremendous success. Hats off to most of the small d Democrats in the region that would not be denied, and I think that there is a lot to take credit for across the spectrum for the democratization, the consolidation of democracy. So much so that in 2001, they signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, member countries of the OAS, which basically stated that democracy was the norm in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that fast forward today, we have, and that for so many years, Cuba was the sole outlier. Well, today we have Venezuela, we have obviously Cuba is still there. We have Nicaragua, which continues to get worse in terms of the authoritarian direction of that country, and we have countries on the cusp. And I think that more than anything, I think speaks to why we need to remain engaged. The United States needs to maintain Venezuela as a priority, because if Maduro succeeds, then Ortega is going to succeed, then Bukele is going to succeed, and AMLO is going to succeed in Mexico in terms of basically hollowing out democratic institutions for the benefit of whoever happens to be in power. And so that, more than anything, speaks to why I believe Venezuela has to maintain a priority. This is the Western Hemisphere, okay? This is not Asia. This is not Africa. This is our neighborhood. This is where, as Marshall said, we live. And so I think we have a double responsibility, obligation to maintain democracy as the norm in our own hemisphere, in our own neighborhood. And so again, when the United States draws back, that's the jungle grows back, and that's my response to that.
I would just say, yeah, this is an issue of U.S. leadership in general. I think obviously the United States is no longer a partner of choice for many countries in the hemisphere, whether we're talking about political partnership or economic partnership. South of Costa Rica, basically every single country's main international trading partner is China now. And part of this is because over time the United States has become increasingly myopic and increasingly bureaucratic. I will never forget doing a sort of war game, and I was so struck by how accurate it was to how Russia, China, and the United States interact with other countries. I was representing Venezuela at the time, and the Venezuelans were asking for assistance. And the person representing China came in and said, what can we do for you? How can we help you? And then the American representative said, listen, you need to get in your offer by today, and if you don't get in by today, then it has to go through this 7-week-long process, and then, at that point, and that's actually how it works on the ground. We're no longer asking countries what they need or want from us. We're just assuming that we know. The fact that in a few years after the devastation of COVID, which rampaged Latin America, where we saw economic devastation, where we saw populations devastated, where we saw the humanitarian impact on the ground so heavily, where we saw democratic backsliding as a result, the idea that in the Summit of the Americas that number one on our agenda had nothing to do with economic development of the region, had nothing to do with political and diplomatic cooperation on public health, but it had to do with something that was important to the United States, which was diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, that is important to this administration, I will give them that. That's actually not the thing that's on the top of the agenda for most of the countries in Latin America. We should not be trying to impose our vision of what is best on these countries. If we want to be partners with them, we have to be partners with them. And that's something that we have really forgotten over time. And as I said, I'm surprised that a democratic administration has forgotten this, because typically they're the ones who emphasize we should not be colonialist about our engagement with other countries. We need to be listening to them. We need to be engaging with them. I don't know when that flew out the window, because I do think that's the right way to do it. And we just haven't done it. By the way, this is a criticism of many administrations, not just the most recent one. I think we have become a little bit too kind of pandering in how we engage with the world.
I think there are, from a U.S. national security standpoint, I think there are several centers of gravity in Latin America. I don't know that El Salvador is. For me, in my way of thinking, Venezuela is at the heart of the spider web. You're talking about a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves, the fourth largest gold reserves, and they have demonstrated a willingness to use that wealth not just to enrich themselves. I think estimates are north of $300 billion stolen by the regime kleptocrats in recent years. But they farm that money out to subvert other countries. If you look, for instance, in Nicaragua, the kickback scheme that they were using with Ortega and the subsidies, so the way they were sending money in through PDVSA was to allow these social works, but then the Ortegas pocketed a huge amount of money and used that money then to start buying up all the local media. So they bought the television stations, they bought the print media, they stuck all of these things under their kids as a way of sort of trying to hide and sanctions harden. But we proved positive when we choked that revenue stream off to Nicaragua from Venezuela, the protests erupted because the government subsidies dried up. So you see how integral they are to these dictatorial or dictatorially minded regimes. And I include, by the way, Argentina in that crowd. It is therefore of the highest stakes that I think we have here with Maduro and potentially the most significant negative consequences for our interest in the region, to allow him to continue to grow stronger and to allow his ability to once again serve as a Chavismo slush fund around the region. This is going to make the current situation, I think, far worse, not better.
You brought up kleptocracy, so I have to sort of have to go there because I run the kleptocracy initiative. Firstly, the past, I guess, few weeks, you've seen the sort of stepping down of the oil minister, and sort of, and I'm not quite clear what happened there. Maduro now says he's running a sort of anti-corruption campaign against PDVSA, and he's sort of, firstly, what should we make of that? I would note that it's a common tactic championed and put forward most aggressively by China to you don't have democratic legitimacy, so how can you sort of get that in the eyes of people? Well, you're the anti-corruption guy, right? So, but I'll let you comment on that maybe. And then, secondly, something I was, when we talk about what Putin wants most, it's always like sanctions relief, or at least it was before the war. I don't know what he wants now. But when I think about what Maduro wants, it's access to the funds that are frozen overseas. The same thing, basically. How can the U.S. help to unlock those frozen funds, which belong to the Venezuelan people, in a helpful way, so that they don't just get stolen, either by Maduro or someone else when they eventually make their way back to Venezuela?
On the PDVSA scandal, obviously the first instinct when you have a regime like this, which is less a government than it is a criminal syndicate, is to believe that somebody is trying to do in somebody else. When you have this lack of institutionality. Somebody's getting even with somebody. But I find completely plausible the idea that the regime went to the accounts and was looking for available funds because they've been pouring a lot of money, a lot of hard currency into shoring up the local currency. They are fighting tooth and nail against the resurgence of hyperinflation. So they've been pouring money to shore up the bolivar. And secondly, they need money for this proposed election in 2024 in order to obviously buy off and pay for political support. So I find it completely shocking that they went to look at the accounts to figure out how much more liquidity they had in either for the shoring up the bolivar or planning for next year in terms of buying the election, whatever electoral process occurs. And even they were surprised that, meaning Maduro and some cronies were surprised at how bare the shelves were. We know everybody's corrupt. We didn't believe that they were that corrupt. And I think that the regime is backpedaling as fast as it can. It's paying a price domestically for the wanton corruption when you're talking about a missing $20 billion from PDVSA accounts, and everybody getting rich, as everybody has under Chavismo. But I think that Maduro and again, those around him, Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, probably were like, oh my God, there's nothing here. As I said, we know everybody's corrupt, but that corrupt? And so I wouldn't put it past them.
I'll let Marshall speak to the assets question. I would say I have been reading a lot of articles about this sort of anti-corruption ouster, and it's amazing to me how many people will say things like, it's unclear if this is the Maduro regime taking corruption seriously or whether it's about like political infighting. No, it's very clear this is political infighting. I mean, the idea that we would even suggest that Maduro is all of a sudden taking this stuff seriously. No, there are different factions within the regime, just as there are different factions within the opposition, just as there are different factions here in the United States. And there are many reasons why they, in particular, were worried about this particular individual, and so they decided to try to oust him, and by the way, all of his associates as well. And so this has nothing to do with corruption. To the extent that it does, it's because they couldn't take the money themselves versus them being concerned that the money is stolen from the Venezuelan people. So I think we in the United States and our journalists also need to be, have that critical thinking where we say, do we think a regime that has systematically stolen, what would you say, $300 billion over the course of however many years, all of a sudden, out of nowhere this day, decides they're going to start being serious about corruption? Or might it be that this regime, which has systematically oppressed all of its adversaries, might be actually falling prey to the factionalization within its own system? And the answer is obviously very clear.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The graft and the corruption and the theft that each of the individual key players in Venezuela has engaged in and engages in, they don't fully overlap and they don't collude together. Okay, so when you look at some of the key testifiers for Maduro, I mentioned Alex Saab as one. These are generally speaking, with some overlap with Delcy and others, but generally speaking, these networks are separate and distinct from the entire kleptocratic mechanism that Diosdado runs versus Tariq al-Assami, who, and both Diosdado and Tariq are deeply into the drugs side of it, so are Celia Flores and her nephews. But they've all at one point or another had their hand in the till at PDVSA because that's the big money. But at no time has any one of the regime insiders really fully dominated the looting from PDVSA. And honestly, Tariq doesn't need the job at PDVSA to continue to harvest the billions that he's getting from the cocaine trade out of Colombia. So is it a manifestation of regime infighting? Yeah. Is it a decision that, you know, we want to re-divvy this up so somebody else takes a turn at the wheel with PDVSA? Absolutely. Is it any huge skin off of Tariq's back to lose that job? Probably not. And oh, by the way, remember, he's the one who's introducing the Iranians and Hezbollah into the country. So he's got his own separate power base that's independent from the rest of these guys. So I think, to Kerry's point, you know, critical questions when certain administration spokesmen come out and say, you know, we welcome the possibility that this is, you know, an investigation. Just surreal to me, but things were said. I just wouldn't put too much emphasis on this. Rather, I would say this is a chance to get the house back in order so somebody new can loot.
That's great. We're coming to the end of our time here. Did I see a question? Yeah, the gentleman back here. I'll have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Hello, I'm Michael McKenna. I'm an intern with CSIS. My question is, what role do you see the Venezuelan armed forces playing in a peaceful transition of power? Again, with an emphasis on the word peaceful.
It's a great question. I think that here we are 20 years into Chavismo. I think that that the traditional military, of course, has been long ago been totally decapitated. And those that are left are simply opportunists that profit from the illicit trafficking of narcotics through Venezuelan territory and are absolutely, completely beholden to the status quo and the regime. So the idea that a patriot will emerge from the upper echelons of the military is a faded aspiration, a faded dream. I think that in the future, again, there's going to have to be another a complete renovation of the military. They have been thoroughly politicized. I don't know what's happened to the professionalism. What remains of any kind of professional military, because it has been totally co-opted by the criminality of the regime.
This was one of the, what I would call, major strategic failings of the administration that I was in, which was the assumption that the Venezuelan military would take seriously their duties to the Venezuelan Constitution. We put a lot of stock in that argument, and it proved to be completely unfounded. As Jose said, you know, Chavez went through a process of systematically politicizing the military, making them much more dependent on the executive branch and political parties. It is very unlikely that they will be an ally in this fight. I think the way in which they have any role is, to the extent that we can get some sort of democratic transition, what will the Venezuelan opposition and the Venezuelan people want to do with respect to transitional justice, and to what extent will the military be held accountable or not? And that's a very open question. We've seen a lot of countries choose to provide amnesty in order to safeguard democracy and sort of say, in the fight between justice and democracy, democracy needs to win, even if it means injustices. So there's that question that they play into, but other than that, I do not see them being a partner in this. And frankly, I'm very worried about watching other countries, and Mexico comes immediately to mind here, following the same strategy that Chavez used to politicize the military, because we're seeing that start to develop in a lot of the countries in the region that are experiencing what we here in DC call democratic backsliding. And so I'm worried that this model is being replicated outside of Venezuela too.
Two things. For 2 years, I pushed without success to put sanctions on Padrino Lopez. The Pentagon fought me. The Department of State was AWOL. He went through the IMED program. We know him. He's the last best chance we have to engage with the Venezuelan military. I kept saying, you do understand he's a fully controlled asset of the Cuban regime. And it was only after he was proven to be fully controlled by the Cubans that finally I got my way and sanctions were imposed on him. Fair?
Fair, that's fair. Marshall won that, yes.
Win most things. It's just
You
how many years
now
does it
we've won.
take?
Next time we serve, it's all.
So that co-optation, but it's deeper. There's a counterintelligence problem. So the Cubans have long understood this challenge, and it's the whole Vanguard issue, right? So how do you set up counterintelligence structures to keep the uniformed military divided, reporting on one another, and uncertain about any ability to sort of form any degree of opposition? And to be honest, they've been highly, highly effective. So it's not just that they're corrupted and benefit, for instance, they all take their cut off of humanitarian assistance coming through the ports or coming through. They also are turned against one another by the Cuban apparatus and surveilled by the Russian mechanisms. So there will eventually have to be a wholesale cleaning of the commissioned officer ranks if democracy is to have a chance in Venezuela.
Jose, you wanted the last word?
Yes, thank you, Nate. I just want to say that I never like to criticize policies without offering alternatives, recommendations. And I think that the problem right now, where we are today on Venezuela, is that Maduro thinks he's the sole author of this script. And U.S. policy needs to get back to a place to disabuse him of the notion that he's the only author of this, and to return to a sanctions regime to disabuse him of this. And some of the things that Marshall was talking about, the workarounds. I'm not talking about, well, let's go in with a whole embargo of Venezuela and all that. No, strategic strikes to cut off some of these workarounds that he's established. More reliance on the individual sanctions. Jorge Rodriguez, let's sanction him. He's a disruptor of democracy. Delcy Rodriguez, let's slap some sanctions on her. That would get their, I guarantee that will get people's attention in Caracas. And serve as a reminder to Nicolás Maduro that the U.S. has a role to play in this. And that if he's not going to play ball, he's going to continue to pay a cost.
Any very final thoughts?
The last thing I would just say is, as we're more or less sleepwalking off a cliff as it comes to our policy in Venezuela, there are actual human costs every single day to the people of Venezuela. We've seen the largest, what I would call forced migration in the history of the region. 7 million Venezuelans have left the country. This is not a gigantic country. It was 28 million, something like that. 7 million have left the country. 187,000 of them came here to the United States in the last year. We're seeing human rights violations every single day. We're seeing an increase in the surveillance capabilities of the state. And so the reason this matters, it matters for U.S. national security for all the reasons that Marshall highlighted. And it matters because every day that we fail to do something to help encourage a transition, we're seeing more and more Venezuelans suffering. And we're allowing China and Russia and Iran to get even more of a foothold into the region at precisely the moment where great power competition is reaching its highest point since the Cold War. So this is critical for American national security, American interests, as well as the interests of our allies, which are the Venezuelan people. And we need to not lose sight of the human cost of this, because that should be motivating our diplomats to be doing more and not just hoping that this resolves itself, because it will not.
Any final thoughts? You're good. Well, I want to thank you. We've run slightly over time, so that's I could keep talking about this all day, but there we are. Not a particularly uplifting conversation, but an important one. And I want to thank our audience for coming out on, as I said, this gloomy Friday morning. And I want to thank all our panelists for their amazing insights as well. The Biden administration may have forgotten about Venezuela, as you said, but it's something we'll continue, for what it's worth, to keep the pressure on here at Hudson Institute. And in the wider region as well. As I said, El Salvador is probably the next event I'm planning on that front. So thank you all, and we look forward to having you back next time.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you.
Thank you.